different seminaries have different emphases. I think the general teaching is that worship time is not chronos, this kind of time, but kairos. But I know that at the Episcopal Seminary at Yale, Berkeley, there is a strong emphasis on keeping it to an hour. You've got to keep a service to an hour. If you can't keep a service to an hour, you've missed a chance. That's just kind of just part of it. And so when I've worked with colleagues who were formed at Yale, there's like a strong sense of like we've got to go, like we've got to get out of here. And I also had a conversation with a colleague. It might have been the colleagues here. It might have been Kathy McGregor. But I was talking about, I would love for us as a congregation to be able to listen comfortably to a 15-minute sermon, maybe even an 18-minute sermon. I'm not saying every sermon needs to be 18 minutes, but when we only preach 10, 11, 12-minute sermons, when you need 15, 16, 17 minutes, it feels like a really long sermon. But sometimes you just need that much time to dig in and to apply it. Some texts are complicated. You can't just decide to do it. I mean, it's learned. It's a learned experience. And part of it is, if we all have that invisible clock, right, running. And I do think Yale is right in some ways that after an hour, a lot of people get antsy, though you can generally build some capacity in there. But certainly if you're stretching that from an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours, then any part that seems to take longer than you want it to, like coming forward for communion or the sermon or the prayers or the announcements, and that's when they become, there's pushback. As long as the whole service doesn't feel that way, nobody thinks the announcements are too long, right? It's the whole service that makes the announcements too long. It's the whole service that makes the sermon too long. All right, well, glad y'all are here. Glad those of you worshiping online are with us. Welcome. It's a small but mighty group here in person, but really grateful for the chance to gather online. It's the second of a 2-week series on Hagar. So we'll look at Hagar, not Hagar the horrible, but Hagar, the mother of a nation. We were talking about that earlier. Last week we looked at when Hagar fled from the abuse of her mistress. And today we're going to look at how she is sent away at the wish of, again, Sarah, her mistress. But before we dig into the text, let's start with a prayer. Let's pray out loud that collect at the top of the page. If you're watching online, you should be able to see it on your screen. Let's pray that prayer wherever we may be. Merciful God, you are the one who sees us and hears our cry. Give us the faith of Hagar, whose obedience enabled the birth of a nation, that we may follow the path you have set before us and persevere in the face of adversity through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Savior, who lives and reigns in union with you and the Holy Spirit, ever one God, world without end. Amen. So a few reminders about Hagar. Last week we looked at Genesis 16. This week we're going to look at Genesis 21. But the biblical account is not the only thing to be said about Hagar. The biblical account is not the only thing to be said about Ishmael. Hagar, who is known as Hagar in the Islamic tradition, she's not mentioned in the Quran, but she is mentioned in some of the oral teachings of the Prophet Muhammad that are recorded in the Hadith, and we'll look at one of those today if we have enough time. But I want to begin our conversation by recognizing that how we hear about Hagar is largely based on our religious tradition and the experience, and sometimes in ways that we don't even realize. And I mentioned last time that Paul, the Apostle Paul, has a lot to say about Sarah and Hagar, about Isaac and Ishmael in his letter to the Galatians. And whether we even think about it or not, that teaching and its importance to the Protestant tradition have largely shaped, I think, how we hear Hagar and Ishmael. Of course, leaving behind the Pauline tradition and the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition has something to say, and as I've already alluded to, the Islamic tradition has something else to say. But what I'd like us to focus on is the Old Testament, the Hebrew story, but to lean into it and to hear it not only as it was written and proclaimed in the ancient world, but what we hear today, given 21st century identity, given interfaith relationships, given gender identities and roles. I wonder how we might hear this story a little differently and discover a fuller appreciation of who Hagar is, maybe even the matriarch in the Bible. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So let's read. I'm going to split Genesis up into two sections. We've got a microphone that Adeline will bring to you. Would someone read for us that first section, which is Genesis chapter 21, and let's read verses 1 through 13, and then we'll stop there for discussion. Who might be willing to read that for us? There are 4 volunteers plus Adeline and me. Linda's willing to read it. Thank you, Linda. And I've chosen the NRSV this time for important reasons, which hopefully we'll see in a little bit. But Linda, thank you. Yep. Oh, Linda needs a handout. There are handouts right there on the table where the coffee pot used to be.
All right.
Thank you.
The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 years old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring.
Thank you. Let's just start with a story. What do you hear? What do you notice? Reading with your 21st century eyes and ears, what sticks out to you? What do you want to know more about? What do you want to comment on? What fits? What doesn't fit? What catches your attention? What grabs you in that part of the story?
I was noticing the timeline. It seems unlikely that it would have taken 8 years for Isaac to be weaned, but the way this is written, if we assume it's chronological, his circumcision and then his weaning,
I think I heard Linda read years, because I think years was on the line before, but 8 days old.
Oh, that
Got
makes
it. So,
more sense.
Yeah. So 8, and
Yep.
we promote breastfeeding. Breast is best. However, 8 is a bit of a stretch,
Yes.
right? 8 years old. But yeah, so circumcision 8 days.
Never
old.
mind. Then I think what I was going to say is perhaps less interesting.
But may we sit with timeline for a little bit?
Yeah.
'Cause my first question is, how old is Ishmael?
Yes, I'm still wondering how long was Isaac breastfed, and then when does that mean this feast is happening? How old is Isaac? How old is Ishmael? Depending on how old everyone is, Hagar might have been like, all right, we're doing okay. Things are seeming fine. The status quo is in a good place. Or it could be a short enough time that she's still feeling anxious.
Yeah.
Makes me curious.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny. The traditions, there are conflicting accounts of the tradition. In the Islamic tradition, which tells this story significantly differently, but with enough similarities that I think you would recognize it. In the Islamic tradition, we'll see later on, Hagar finds a spring of water. In the Bible, the Jewish tradition, the water is then given to Ishmael. But in the Islamic tradition, Hagar, drinks the water, which enables her to nurse Ishmael. So in the Islamic tradition, Ishmael is still nursing at this time, which really messes up the timeline. Yeah. I want to read it. I feel drawn to read this timeline not needing everything to match up. At the end of last week's reading, at the end of chapter 16, we hear that Abram was 86 when Ishmael was born. We read here that he is 100 when Isaac is born. So you might say that Ishmael is 14. However, we're going to read later in this chapter that he is not 14. He's a baby. And so what does that mean? So how do we read anyway? So you kind of got to squint a little bit and make it line up there. But I'm drawn there as well. Maybe apart from the timeline, I still sense, regardless of how old Ishmael would have been, that Hagar and Ishmael are vulnerable in this story, for sure. And I think the Bible, which surprises me, the Bible allows us to see Hagar's vulnerability as mother. Given how interested the Bible seems to be to get rid of them, it's interesting to me that they draw us into that sympathy. Yeah, that's a long-winded response. But anyway, yeah. All right, what else do you notice? What else do you want to know more about? What do you see? What strikes you? Yeah, Susie.
I'm interested by whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you.
Yeah.
In tradition of patriarchy,
Yeah.
that's very different.
Yeah. I wonder why it gets written this way. I wonder why it doesn't get written, Abraham got so fed up with Sarah that he finally said, sure, whatever you want. I wonder why it gets written this way instead of Sarah looked at Abraham and he knew right away what he had to do. I wonder why it gets written this way as in Sarah, Sarah's upset and Abraham's upset and God seems to be the one that, God's way of saying it's going to be okay is just listen to Sarah and do what she says. I'll take care of it. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah. What else do you notice? Yeah, Dave.
So you said that do whatever she says, I'll take care of it. That actually sort of struck out. That stuck out to me this time as well because, yes, we'll deal with Isaac, and don't worry, we'll deal with the other guy too. And it's just, it was very, yeah, fine, whatever you guys want, I'll fix it up at the end.
Yeah. Well, it's a long response. But given the weather, I started thinking yesterday about what I would do if I had to preach. Because I don't know what it's like where Adeline lives on the west side of town. I don't know what roads get clear. I don't know if I'm going to get here. But I just started thinking, what am I going to preach about? And I sort of started writing a sermon, not really a sermon, but just some ideas in my head. And as I was doing that, I thought, I wonder what I'll leave out. Because when you have to, at the last minute, or when you haven't thought it out or haven't rehearsed it, you're going to lose some important stuff. And you hope that the Spirit enables us to hear it. And yet, even when we write a sermon and write a careful sermon, if it's been a week or longer writing it, still there's some things that get missed. By the time this text gets to us, it almost feels like nothing gets missed, like nothing's accidental. We've had generations to make sure that this is like this. So for example, when we see in verse 11, the matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. No mention of Hagar, just his son. But in verse 12, God says, don't be distressed because of the boy and because of the slave woman, your wife. I can't read that and think, they just forgot to mention Hagar the first time. They knew they weren't mentioning Hagar the first time. It's almost like God is helping us see that parallelism. And isn't it interesting, as you point us to, Dave, what gets missed? Like when Sarah speaks and Sarah says it, and then Abraham picks it up and responds to it, and it's amazing to me what isn't included. Yeah, I want the text to say so much more than it does. For everything it does tell us, there are a dozen things that it doesn't, that I feel like all of us are desperate to know. Yeah. All right, George.
Well, I was going to say something very parallel to what you already said.
If you take that microphone and hold it right up to your mouth.
Sorry about
Yeah,
that.
there you go.
Mumble. I was going to say something that's very parallel to what you just said. So the idea is that God has it all figured out ahead of time. Mm-hmm. And as you said, historically, that leads inexorably, is how you pronounce it, to that situation. There's two conflicting things: the obedience to the patriarch, which we assume is tied to our obedience to God. That's the Jewish tradition. Obedience to God is the same thing as obedience to the patriarch. On the other hand, you have God who's figured it out ahead of time, and he knows that the response is going to happen from Sarah. So, and he's already planned it out. That's another take on it.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we were doing a Bible study on Abraham or Sarah or Hagar, the whole thing, if we were doing a Bible study on the whole story, I think that would even be more clear to us. Remember last week, Sarah says, look, I'm old. I got an idea. Go into my slave woman and see if she'll bear me a son. Sarah says, bear me a son, right? By the end of the story, we get to see that it's not her son, it's Abram's son. But Sarah seems to think, all right, I know it's supposed to work this way. Let me see if I can figure it out. And behind that, the subtext is, God's got it figured out. Sarah, why do you feel the need to do it? Why do you feel the need to do that? Why can't you trust God's made a promise? Isn't God going to keep God's promise? The first bullet point I have is to remember what happens between 16 and 21. Here are some of the things that happen. There's a splitting between Lot and Abram. They have too much property. Their herds are too big, so they need to split. Lot goes to the city. Abram stays in the country. Then we see what happens to Sodom and Gomorrah where Lot went, right? Bad things happen there, right? Then in the chapter, then we have circumcision. God shows up and says, all right, I got an idea. Want you to be sure that we're in this covenant. Please circumcise yourself and all the males in your household. Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised. I want you to imagine that, or not. Then we get to the next chapter and we get Abimelech. You might remember the Abimelech bit. I mentioned last week about Pharaoh, that when Abram and Sarai were walking through Egypt, Abram said, why don't you tell Pharaoh you're my sister so that he can have sex with you and he won't kill me to try to take you as his wife. So she agreed, or at least the Bible is silent to that agreement. But we saw how that worked out. But in the chapter before this, we get Abimelech, sort of a territorial overlord, if you will, and they do the same thing. Even after the Ishmael birth, even after the conflict, Abraham says to Sarah, even after the covenant, the circumcision, the enshrinement of this promise of a nation, Abraham says to his wife Sarah, look, Abimelech, I don't want him to kill us. Would you please pretend to be my sister again? Can we go through that again, right? So at every step, it's, does anybody believe that God's got it? Does anybody believe that God will take care of it? Including Abraham, not just Sarah. I don't want to ignore the fact that Abraham is just as doubtful, if you will. So that's what's been happening. That's what gets us to this point. We've had the questions about Ishmael, how old Ishmael is, but just what's it like to have a child, at least as the Bible presents us, to have a child for 14 years, probably 16 years now, because it's 2 years or so when a child might be weaned, we would expect. So a 16-year-old, but even if it's not really a 16-year-old, even if you squint and look at it differently, a child who's been with you a long time. I mean, a friend I used to work with, whose name was Ashley, her dog had an unexpected litter of puppies, and she needed to get rid of these puppies. And so she met somebody at an exit rest area between where Montgomery and Birmingham to let them pick out a puppy. And while she was there with a box full of puppies, this person that she wasn't expecting to meet said, oh, you have puppies? I can't have a puppy, but may I look at it? And she said, sure, why don't you hold one? Well, she got rid of 2 puppies that day, because you know what? Once you hold that puppy, Abram's son had grown up for 14 years of walking and talking and hunting and singing and sleeping and praying and traveling and dreaming. 14 years. And now this? Just because the Bible doesn't tell us a lot about that, don't lose sight of how deep that relationship was. And even as Sarah was harsh to Hagar, there's a relationship between Abraham and Hagar now that also, it's messy, and it's not, it's certainly not simple, but it's worth noting that as well. So just don't forget about how much has passed. This isn't 2 days later. It's years later. I noticed that Hagar's name isn't mentioned here, right? Like the mother, in the first part, right? Mentioned Ishmael's name isn't mentioned there, but notice at the beginning. Right? At the beginning, we don't see Ishmael's name anywhere in the text, and we don't get Hagar at the beginning, right? We only get Hagar at the middle, at the end, and so it's almost like we're not even naming that. There's a I don't want to say a power play there, but there's a strategy there. A lot of ink has been spilt over what is Ishmael doing. Take a look at verse 9. Sarah saw the son of Hagar, no name, saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian. Just remember Hagar, which means foreign one, stranger, at least in the Jewish Hebrew roots. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, not Sarah, but Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. And that seems to be the impetus for cast out this slave woman with her son. What were they doing? Were they playing? Notice I've given you 5 other translations of that verse or the surrounding verses. And let me just read them out loud for us so that those who are watching online can hear these as well. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Sarah saw Hagar's son laughing, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. One day Sarah noticed Hagar's son Ishmael playing, and she said to Abraham, get rid of that Egyptian slave woman. So just playing, but not playing with my son, just playing. The Message says, one day Sarah saw the son that Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham poking fun at her son Isaac. Now that's different. The World English Bible says Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. That's a different kind of playful laughing. The root of the word is laugh. Laugh is as good a word as we've got. But what does that mean? It's a playful laughter. It's the same playful laughter that Sarah offered in verse 6. God has brought laughter from me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. But not Hagar's son. He's not going to laugh with me. Right? And so linguistically, there's actually a root. Sarah's laughter is the birth of Isaac. Ishmael doesn't have a place in that relationship. If he's laughing, there's a connection. A lot of times commentators want to tell us, what's a 16-year-old doing playing with a 2-year-old? That can't be right. And sometimes they read into it rough play, wrestling, or even molesting. There's nothing in the text that draws that out. You could stretch and make that claim, but there's nothing in this text that suggests to us that Sarah needs to get rid of Ishmael because he's abusing her son Isaac. That's not in the text. Instead, I think the Bible wants us to see in the second half of what she does in verse 10, she doesn't want the son of the slave woman to inherit with her son Isaac, her son. Ishmael, again, doesn't get named. Y'all know that in the Bible, being the first son is important, right? A double portion of the inheritance. That doesn't mean that they get twice as much as everybody else, but the firstborn gets a double share, and everybody else, every other male would get a single share. As long as Ishmael's around, how's that going to work out? Can the covenant, if Ishmael's just hanging around, can God's people see that the covenant is being carried out through Sarah, Isaac, and beyond? If Ishmael and his children are still hanging around, how does that even get clarified, right? Sometimes when parents divorce and get remarried, half brothers or sisters or step siblings, sometimes things get messy with an inheritance. And that's only, one family unit. We're talking about, the biblical patriarchy. How does that all get sorted out? So it feels the Bible seems to want us to focus on the inheritance issue. And so to that, I ask the question: is Sarah's request a reasonable one? And as weird as it sounds, the more I lean into this text, the more I think Sarah's being very reasonable. Sarah knows that things aren't going to work out well for her. She's old. Abraham's old. They might die while her child is still very small. If they die while Isaac is still very small, what do you think Ishmael's going to do to Isaac? What do you think Hagar's going to do to Isaac? Maybe, but it's not Game of Thrones. But it kind of feels a little like it, right? It feels a little like that. Who will become the heir? But I think it's easy for me to read this completely with 21st century sensibilities, and actually nobody's looking. Nobody's there to keep Isaac safe. So I wonder if that was her own survival instinct. Hagar, of course, Egyptian, foreigner, slave woman, mistress. Mistress in that sense, but property. She's the easy one to get rid of, right? She's, of course, God says, do whatever Sarah says. Sarah's preferred, right? Thoughts about that? How do you hear that? How do you receive that today? Yeah, George.
The thing that strikes me is laughter and how disparate or how different it can be. One, it's the relief from seriousness or somberness. For example, Sarah's laughter initially was that of joy, a relief from tedium, relief from inexorable death. And so it's an affirmation of life. On the other hand, laughter is often, especially in the Old Testament, especially in the Calvinistic tradition, which was trying to, is associated with mockery, is associated with disrespect. It's associated with basically a lack of knowing your place. So it has classist overtones also. I know that in India, for example, if you're, at least it used to be, if you were lower caste and even a person of higher caste walked by and you were laughing, you're dead.
Yeah.
You could be, that's what they say anyway. So it was tremendously sensitive to it. I noticed that had two groups of friends where I lived before. One of them, the laughter was always celebratory and inclusive. In the other group of acquaintances, laughter was always derisive. It was interesting. And also some TV stations are that way, or some channels. All the laughter, all the humor is made of mockery, of denigration, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So that's the dichotomy there.
Yeah, you remind me, I skipped over it, but in Genesis 18, that's the visitation at the Oaks of Mamre. The Rubelev icon that's often associated with the Trinity is actually the visit. Genesis 18 is the visitation at the Oaks of Mamre. It's some travelers come by, and Abraham says, quick, let's prepare for them, and it's God in the form of these three travelers. And when they say to Abram, your child Sarah is going to have a baby in the spring, Sarah laughs. She laughs then. And her laughter there is mocking, derision, I don't believe you. Like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've heard. Have you seen how old I am? And then they call her out and say, why did you laugh? And she said, I didn't laugh. They said, yes, you did laugh. So the laughter becomes important. But you remind us, if the linguistic word for what Ishmael is doing is laughing, and the fact that Sarah's laughing earlier, that laughter is supposed to belong to Sarah. And so even if he's not mocking anybody, the fact that he's laughing is itself a mock. It's making mock of their station, of their status, of their class. I think it's a keen insight. Absolutely. Yeah, so laughter, and yes. So if you just say laugh, one might miss that, right? So it's a mocking, playful, presumptuous gesture, right? All of that gets wrapped up in there. We kind of need more than English is able to convey to us in that bit. All right, a couple of bits. The story didn't have to be this way, right? I mean, God made it this way, but it didn't have to be this way. If you were writing a story of the patriarchs, like, why would you have Ishmael born first, right? Why would you even why would you do that, right? Why would you mention that story, right? Families are really good at keeping secrets. This is what families do, and yet we're going to preserve the messiness of this. God is at work in that messiness and in the preservation of and the transmission of this story. It didn't have to be this way, but it is this way. So given that, I'm surprised that the Bible allows us to see Abraham's emotions in verse 11. The matter was very distressing, deeply grieving to Abraham. Why? Why let us see that? If the Bible's goal is to clarify and to clean up the inheritance issue, and to say we've got to get rid of Ishmael and Hagar, the covenant is going to be through Sarah and Isaac, why allow us to grieve with Abraham? What do we benefit? How do we benefit from hearing of Abraham's distress? Yeah, George.
That's the reality of human emotions. In other words, God in his great love for us really understands the conflict emotions that we have. And we don't necessarily have to subsume them. Obedience to God doesn't mean you feel no emotions. It means that you take an emotion and then resolve it.
Yeah. Thank you. What else? What else do you get from that? partly it makes Abraham a fuller person, but it also makes Ishmael and Hagar people, not just instruments. You know, I think it fills out. We don't hear of their experience much in this. Nobody interviews Hagar about what that felt like, but there was an emotional connection. She was important in that family system. So was Ishmael, and they become real people, not just farm animals. I want to say, you know, when pets are beloved, when pets die, it feels like the death of a family member. Not quite the same, but it's significant. Our family has a legendary story about a family member who was given a calf, a baby cow, by a local farmer. They lived in an agricultural area. And so they decided to name it Norman, after, at the time, her husband, this family member's husband. And when it came time to kill the animal and eat it, they just couldn't do it because it is Norman. I mean, anyway, so the farmer killed it and gave it away to somebody else. Later, there was a messy divorce, at which time the woman wished she could go back and eat the calf named after her now ex-husband. But when we name something, right, when we consider it a pet, we get an emotional response to it, right? And so the fact that the Bible seems to want to avoid naming them, and yet we at least get to see the emotional response. There's a personhood, there's a relationship behind that, and I think that's helpful. Even if we can't hear much about Hagar's distress, we'll get there in a little bit. Her distress seems more about, I'm about to die, and so is my son, but not the dissolution of the relationship. But at least Abraham allows us to see it. All right, the last question I want to ask before we move to the second part is, so why does God offer this particular reassurance in verse 12 and 13? God says, don't be distressed. Do what she tells you. It is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. That's part of what's being assured. But the other part is, as for the son of the slave woman, I'll make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. Remember last week in Genesis 16, we saw God show up and promise Hagar that her child, Ishmael, would be the father of a nation. Wild ass of a man, you might remember that part better. So why when God shows up and says to Abraham, don't worry, do what Sarah tells you, why does he say both? Isaac is going to be the offspring for your lineage, but also the slave woman's child is going to be a different nation. Why does God need to mention that to Abraham? Why does God need to mention that to us?
Genesis wasn't written first, right?
Yep.
So one of the things I was thinking about as we were reading through the Bible Challenge last year is a lot of it would be foolish to write the story in such a way that Israel was sort of just massively victorious and was obviously in charge of everything, because nobody who was reading it would have experienced that situation, right? So you need an explanation for why are we important but not in charge of everything. So why are there other people out there who are also, seem to be really, a really big deal, and yet we're still the chosen ones.
Yeah.
That it would be very strange to sort of read this story that just said, "Yep, Isaac's got everything," and because that's just not the experience that people would have been sort of seeing day to day.
Yeah.
Hearing the story.
Yeah, part of that reminds me, when a parent tells a child, you can be anything you want to be, right? We tell our children, anything you set your mind to, you can do. And when they discover actually they can't, look at Elizabeth and me, we're, this tall, right? Our children are not going to play in the NBA. No matter how much they might want to, it's just not going to happen. And eventually our children sort of encounter that, and it's not helpful in that moment to say, but I told you could be anything you want. It's your fault. Where'd you screw this up, right? But, so there's a historical reality that comes with that sort of promise. And so as you remind us, this story helps us understand that it's not always coming up roses, right? Just, what it means to be of the descendant of Abraham doesn't mean that everything's going to be easy. Yeah. Yeah. George.
One thing that we're the top, we're the best, we're invincible, it's a lie that is in service of the ego, of self-importance, basically a disobedience to God, if you think of it that way. And I remember in my generation, as we were growing up, we really were all said, oh, you can do anything. And that ends up with a lot of my peers start taking shortcuts. So you basically, like, not only do they think they could do anything, but they are everything. They know everything. So they're not. We are not receptive to new knowledge. We're not receptive because we didn't bother to study. We didn't bother to read. We didn't bother to inform ourselves. So we end up arrogant and false, and that translates all the way up to the top. But occasionally. But that's also the situation is that God doesn't just want it doesn't seem that he's just saying only obedience and only hierarchy, but rather that love that he has for us has emotion too, just like Abraham does. So in Abraham, who's hierarchical figure, a paternalistic hierarchical figure, feels emotions and then so that and perhaps by implication, so does God.
Thank you. Let's read the second part. Who would read for us, please? 14 through 21. It's not quite the end of the chapter, but it's the part we're going to read. Who would read that bit for us, please? Jim, would you read that for us? Thank you, Jim.
So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, and she cast the child under one of the bushes, then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat up opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. An angel of God called at Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt.
Thank you. What do you think that morning was like for Hagar and Ishmael? Like what's that like to be set off on that journey? We don't get that. We don't get to see that. We just get Abraham waking up and sending her off. And we get to see her in her distress in the wilderness. But what was that last look like? What weeping filled the air on both in Abraham and in Hagar and Ishmael? Where was Sarah? Right? What was the look in her eyes? Was she embarrassed? Was she delighted? Did she have that evil kind of cunning look? There's so much in that moment that isn't depicted to us. Yet, the passage isn't just a passage of departure. It carries on. The director of this scene journeys with Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness. And kind of, there's a stub, right? We get to the end of this, right? Ishmael, he grows up and makes a great nation, and I'm not sure we'd say lives happily ever after, but we kind of get there. So in some ways, there's a narrative arc that needs to be at least sort of continued. And yet there's more to it than just that ending. We could have skipped verse 15 through 19, and we could have, she departed and wandered about the wilderness of Beersheba. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow. He lived in the mother of a wife. But the Bible gives us this moment of near death. Why? Why do we get to see that? Why are our hearts hooked by this? Why does the Bible want us to connect here? Yeah, George.
Well, in that period particularly, and of course even now, being part of a community is critical to this.
Yep.
Being cast out on your own, it's not just a matter of the fact you might not survive, but that you don't have any. You don't have any. And secondly, there's that status, the loss of status. You have this promise, I'm going to inherit Abraham's dominion, and all of a sudden you're nothing. But also it means that I think what's transmitted here is that God is with you despite your loss of these things. And in the inception of, I think that God operates only through Israel. If you're part of Israel, then you're part of God. If you're separated from Israel, you're not part of God anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think Susie's got something to say in just a second, but I also think, I wonder if there's a desire. I mean, this is not, we know that the people who preserve this story are the descendants of Abraham and Isaac, not the descendants of Abraham and Ishmael. And so I wonder if there's a sense of, kind of excusing our ancestral or cultural guilt by at least giving a kind of sympathetic story, allowing us to kind of have a cry about this so that we can then move on, right? Yeah, Susie.
I also think this shows that God's promises are not a straight line.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not going to be easy.
Yes. God's promises are not a straight line, which, is a wonderful openness to the story of Islam, right? I mean, this, if we read from the Jewish text a sense that God's promise, God's connection, God's relationship is not just through Abraham. There's Ishmael, not just through Isaac, but through Ishmael as well. That leaves sort of built-in space for other traditions. Yeah. Notice a couple of things. Because of the time, we're going to push through this part fairly quickly. But notice that she lifts up her voice and weeps, and yet God hears the boy's voice. I find that confusing. I don't have an answer for you. Notice that the angel of God, right, calls not to the boy but to Hagar. It's hard to read verses 15 through 19 and imagine Ishmael as a 16-year-old. He's not 16. I mean, this part of the story lets us know he's a child, maybe even a toddler, right? And so the story gets a little confused about how old and chronologically and timeline, which makes me wonder if the story is completely free from a timeline, if it's not trying to convey to us a chronology of historical events, that makes the fact that it conveys this even more interesting, right? If it's not about just now the story of Ishmael, the fact that Ishmael gets included in the story becomes even more strange, important, perhaps significant that way. Again, I've asked you the question, if the only thing this was serving was to clarify the lineage is through Isaac, we don't need these bits. But there's more than that. We get a sense of who God is, who the patriarchs are, who Abraham is, but also who Hagar and Ishmael are. I wonder what the story would be like if it were written from their perspective. Part of the answer, I think, comes from this last reading that I have for you, which is from the Hadith. Again, this is the oral tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, not the Quran, but the oral tradition that was written down, the Hadith. And this is from a particular section. And it's about this story, but notice how different it is. And let me just read it for us. And listen for what's similar, but also listen for what's significantly different. Abraham brought Hagar and her son Ishmael, while she was still suckling him, to a place near the Kaaba, under a tree on the spot of Zamzam, at the highest place in the mosque. During those days there was nobody in Mecca, nor was there any water. So he made them sit over there and placed near them a leather bag containing some dates and a small water skin containing some water, and set out homeward. Ishmael's mother followed him, saying, "O Abraham, where are you going, leaving us in this valley where there is no person whose company we may enjoy, nor is there anything to enjoy, meaning water or food? She repeated that to him many times, but he did not look back at her. Then she asked him, has Allah ordered you to do so? He said, yes. She said, then he will not neglect us. What do you hear in those words? What do you hear in that tradition? What does that tradition give us, give the world, that maybe the Old Testament or the Hebrew tradition doesn't? What do you hear in that bit? There's some narrative differences, of course. Abraham's on the journey with them. They're dates, not just water. They go to a particular place, not the wilderness of Beersheba, but what eventually becomes Mecca. But what are the spiritual differences? What are you drawn into there? It wasn't at the time until an angel came. An angel comes in the next bit. I didn't give it to you, but in the next bit, an angel comes. We would call Gabriel. They would call it Jabril. And the tip of the wing of an angel stirs up the ground, and in that spot, she finds a spring, and that becomes a well, and it becomes a famous well at Mecca. Yeah. What else do you notice? She's presented to us as a person of deep faith, isn't she? Maybe that's true in the Hebrew tradition as well. I mean, I think one has to have faith in order for God to show up and speak to you the way that God showed up and spoke to Hagar, or at least the nexus of the fecundity of faith. And yet, her response, she doesn't have the answer yet, and she says, Allah, God will provide, God will take care of us. Which of course God does in both stories, but the Hadith feels like it's the Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael story, not the Sarah and Isaac story. It's great. In the Islamic tradition, Abraham went many times to go visit Ishmael and Hagar. One of the traditions is that when he went to visit one time, Ishmael was out hunting, and Abraham did not approve of Ishmael's choice of a wife, and so he left a message with the wife and said, hey, tell my son you need to change your threshold. So he divorced her. And then he came back later on, and he was pleased with the second daughter-in-law and said, I like this threshold, and so he kept her as a wife. Part of that tradition. But yeah, in the Islamic tradition, Abraham went back and forth several times. In the Islamic tradition, Ishmael is the one who was almost killed with a knife, not Isaac. Yeah. In my reading of this story, as we finish, in my reading of the story of Hagar is primarily, in the Jewish Christian tradition, defined as the wrong one. She's the wrong one. She's not Sarah, she's the other one. Even if we don't know her name, in fact, we probably don't know her name, but even if we don't know her name, she's defined as the other one, the not belonging one, the Egyptian, the slave woman, not the mother of the promise, as Paul will tell us. If the only way we hear Hagar is as the wrong one, then her story, her witness, her faithfulness is lost on us. Then there's no value. A second look, even at the Hebrew text, not to mention the Islamic text, but a second look at the Hebrew text lets us know that there's more to it than that. It's both. It presents us an unfair, unbalanced perspective, but buried in that text, if we allow ourselves to dig into it, there's so much more to it. She's not only the slave woman. She's the mother of a nation. She's the only person in the Hebrew Scriptures to give God a name. She is the one who receives the promise of a nation. She is a matriarch. As much as Abraham is a patriarch, just as we saw last week, she had taken Sarah's place as the bearer of a child. By the end of last week's lesson, we saw her as the taker of Abraham's place as the mother of a nation. And now this week, we see her again taking that place as the one whom God will provide, God will care for, God will protect. We don't hear those stories. We don't preach about those stories. Those are important stories for us to hear. They're not foreign to our tradition. They're in our tradition. We've just forgotten or maybe been led in ways that prevent us from hearing them or seeing them. Thank y'all. Good to be with you. Next week at 10 o'clock, the annual meeting. A wonderful chance to hear about our church, to elect our vestry, and to check in with each other online, but also in person. 2 weeks from today, Laura Walsh is going to begin a 4-week series on world religions. So I hope you'll tune in either online or in person. That's 2 weeks from today. Thank y'all for being with us. Yay.